Hi there, and thank you for joining me today for this live reading of the Winemakers box set by Giovanna Siniscalchi. This is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. The True Purpose of Vines. Chapter 1. Oporto, Portugal, June 1870. Wine makes a man better pleased with himself. I do not say that it makes him more pleasing to others. Samuel Johnson. Mingle with the natives? I'll do nothing of the sort. Griffin leaned against the coach's leather squabs and lowered his sister's farewell note. Why couldn't Anne understand this trip to the High Douro wasn't a summer vacation? He wasn't leaving his townhouse in Oporto, his orderly British house, to brave the Alto Douro for fun. The Douro River was Portuguese territory, home to the quintas that produced port wine. It was a wild, unruly corner of the world that held no interest for Griffin. His sister was too peninsular, mixing Portuguese words with English, caring too much for her local friendships, and holding irrational romantic ideas. It was his fault. She would have turned out a proper English lady if he had prevented them from moving to Portugal. When he returned home from the Douro, he would send her to a finishing school, a British one. Griffin shut the coach's window, keeping the scent of new leather and polished wood uncontaminated by the dust outside. The steady clip-clop of the matching blacks filtered through the lacquered panels. He craned his neck to see Thunder's elegant gait hitched behind the coach. The horse had cost him a king's ransom, but the thoroughbred imported from Weatherby Stud, with his well-chiseled head, lean body, and bold spirit, was a prize. If anything, Griffin's stay in the country would be an excellent opportunity to stretch its legs and test the horse's speed. Coachman Roberto, a tenacious Portuguese of undetermined age, gave the horses free rein. At least Jaco, his jack-of-all-trades, had preceded him to the vineyard last week. Otherwise, the servant's constant chatter would follow him all the way to the Alto Douro. The carriage jostled forward, sending Griffin's briefcase to the floor and scattering his carefully organized papers. Sitting back in the leather squabs, he closed his eyes and tugged at his neckcloth. His legs were too large for the confined space. Restlessness started in his stomach and traveled to his feet, making them twitch. Why was it such a bother to travel? He forced his jaw to unclench. The prize dangling after this blasted trip, the status Maxwell and Croft port shippers would amass, was worth it. The Douro churned by the roadside. After a squall, the river turned unpredictable, as the giant oak floating in the depths could testify. When Griffin signed the partnership, no one could ever uproot his family again. His mother and sister would be sought after in Oporto's British community. No scandals hovering over their prospects like clouds before a storm. They could shove the past behind them. His father's bankruptcy in London, the risk of debtor's prison, and losing every asset they owned. But marriage? He did not expect the partnership to come with those strings attached. Cunning old Croft had gotten the upper hand. Griffin envisioned the girl's youthful face, cornflower blue eyes, and blonde ringlets. Elizabeth Croft was 18 at most. The thought made him feel ancient, but he must marry at some point. He was 31. The girl would make a good wife, dutiful, proper. A man could do much worse. He should count his blessings. After he set his late uncle's vineyard to rights, he would return to Oporto, marry the girl, and merge his business with Croft. Exhaling, he collected his envelopes and greeting cards, then the book on financial futures he meant to read. Next came the useless Guide for the Englishman Gentleman Traveling Up the Douro, with its queer illustrations. One paper lodged below the back-facing seat, the map of Quinto de Vesuvio. He flicked his eyes over the poor rendering of the property. It's the best wine producer in the Douro. Vesuvio stood to the Douro's right side, neighboring Griffin's vineyard. 2 years before, the late owner took money from Croft to increase wine production, a common practice in their trade. When the British port traders perceived an increase in future demand, they financed the Portuguese winemakers' increase in grapevine planting. Then, this Mr. Ferreira had died, and Croft worried the widow would not deliver the agreed port barrels. Croft called it an old man's intuition and asked him to check the property's new plantings, but Griffin was in no hurry to visit this quinta. Vesuvio? He scoffed. Didn't they know it was spelled Vesuvius? Only after he set his property to rights would he meet this paragon. His mind conjured an image for the widow, a hirsute crone with codfish breath, and he flinched. Better to deal with the estate manager. The carriage lurched and came to a sudden stop. Muffled sounds of shouting and laughter intruded from outside. Through the window, Griffin saw only tall shrubbery and wild vegetation. "Move!" the coachman yelled. Griffin rapped on the roof. "What is it, Roberto?" "It's the diligence, sir." Just his luck to meet the Portuguese mail coach on this rutted road. Griffin unlatched the door and alighted, landing in a lake-sized mud puddle. He lifted a foot, glaring at his dripping boot. Damn, his new Hessians were ruined. An urchin raced by, splotching foul-smelling muck all over Griffin's tailored coat. Cursing under his breath, he followed a trail of laughter, cheers, and hollered profanities. Blocking the narrow road, some dozen peasants crowded a poor excuse for a vehicle. He rubbed his eyes against the harsh sunlight. What is going on? Nothing much, sir. Their harness broke, Roberto said. Wild vegetation flanked the path on one side, and a pasture fence stood to the left, trapping them behind the swarming peasants. Griffin took his handkerchief and failed to clean the drying splotches of mud clinging to his silk cravat and vest. His watch showed 12:30. They were running 45 minutes late. Go check how long it will take to fix it. Coachman Roberto cleaned sweat from his brow. Right away, Mr. Maxwell. While Roberto tried to catch his attention, the diligence driver, a bow-legged man shaggier than the beasts, wrapped a stout rope around the animals, as if trying to tie them together would prevent them from falling. At least 3 kinds of quadruplets were hitched, 2 bedraggled horses in the front row, a mismatched pair of mules next, and the last 2 could either be jackasses or oversized terriers. Finished with the rope, the shaggy coachman climbed on his perch atop the wooden coach. Howling obscenities, he flared his long whip, but the animals seemed more keen on sleeping than cooperating. Meanwhile, the passengers hooted with laughter and took part in the bizarre spectacle by pushing the pathetic Noah's Ark on wheels. Griffin scoffed, shaking his head. The bloody diligence was a unified effort to be ridiculous. Just his luck to be trapped in this unruly corner of the world filled with sawdust pillows, sleepless nights, old flycatchers, and toothless grins. Still, the faster he arrived at his vineyard, the sooner he could return to Oporto. Avoiding another mud puddle, Griffin circled the coach to the driver's seat, where his saddle was stored. Roberto shuffled back, looking harrowed. Mr. Maxwell, sir, no more than half an hour now. Never mind, Roberto, I'll ride the final part of the journey. But, sir, it's still miles from Villanova village. What if... Thunder is well rested, and I scheduled a meeting with my vineyard's manager at 2 o'clock. It's dangerous. There could be highwaymen, and they don't like British... I'm taking my pistols. Chapter 2. From Wine What Sudden Friendship Springs. John Gay. Griffin wasn't lost. He was momentarily unable to find his way. Could he be blamed? When the oaks, denuded of cork bark, guarded the forest like naked soldiers? According to his map, beyond this copse of trees lay Villanova village and his inherited vineyard. Sunbeams filtered through the emerald foliage and pooled on the golden hay covering the ground. He touched his heels to Thunder's flanks, letting the horse stretch his legs among the trunks. Just as he had managed to find the light at the end of the forest, grunts and twigs snapped to his right. A shadow barreled forward. Neighing loud enough to make the oaks cover their private parts, Thunder reared. Griffin lost his seat and his posteriors met the ground. Cursing the Portuguese wilderness, he brushed dead leaves from his trousers. Thunder breathed heavily, his civilized fetlocks trembling. Griffin patted his neck, reassuring the steed he wasn't to blame, and looped his reins around an olive tree. The true culprit for his fall backed away and hid under a bush. It was a boar, its gray body poking from between the leaves. His friend Boyd was right. The Douro teemed with game. Griffin could feel the creature's menacing stare, and silently he grabbed his pistol. The wind picked up speed, felling an oak's log. Startled, Griffin pulled the trigger and the recoil jerked his arm. The blast echoed in the ravine. Wings flapped over his head, upsetting the silence. Instead of an animal grunting in pain, a scream pierced the forest. The boar was nowhere in sight. What the hell? Pulse thundering, Griffin rushed in the sound's direction, vaulting over a fallen trunk, his steps echoing in the wake of that very human screech. He arrived at a clearing. By the foot of a hill, a body sprawled on the dirt. A woman. He dropped to her side, sending up plumes of dust, and reached for her neck. The steady drum of a heartbeat greeted his finger pads. Thank God. His heart moved from his throat back to his chest, and he exhaled loudly. Her clothes were intact, free of gaping wounds or bloodstains. Hands quivering, Griffin cradled her head, upsetting her straw hat and freeing a lush black mane. The soft strands tangled around his fingers and covered part of her face. He passed his hand over her smooth brow and prominent cheeks. A pair of wide eyes appeared from behind curling lashes. Her forehead creased, and she tensed to rise from his lap. You are hurt. Try not to move. Griffin pressed her shoulder blade, trying again in his poor Portuguese. Fica deitada. She swiveled her head from side to side as if orienting herself, and then her eyes took on a distant glaze. A beat later, they fluttered shut. Had she fainted? Griffin brought a trembling hand to her cheek. Her skin warmed his fingertips, satiny and dewy and soft. Too soft. What is your name? Julia, she croaked. Julia, look at me. Where are you wounded? I think my head hurts. She tried to stand, and Griffin helped her, careful she did not topple down again. She brushed dirt from her clothes, and her lips curled upward. That smile was quite remarkable, white teeth bright against her olive skin. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he averted his eyes. I shot you. Shot? No, I fell from that terrace. She turned to the line of rocks behind them. The gunshot startled me. I must have lost my footing. Are you sure? She raised her arms and spun in a slow circle. There, satisfied? No wounds. Griffin nodded, and the muscles of his shoulders released their grip on his spine. He hadn't harmed her, thank God. He wiped his hands on his trousers and inspected their surroundings. They were in the middle of a flat patch of land, a valley encircled by vine-planted hills. Beyond the rocks, dry hay covered the ground, a few olive trees rising like green islands in a straw-colored sea. The woman arched a black brow. Why were you shooting? Is something wrong? She was young, mid-20s, but she was no simpering miss. There was an air of authority in her posture, in her clear voice, and in the way she looked straight into his eyes. He cleaned a speck from his coat. A boar. Boar? She scoffed. There is no boar here. You are mistaken. I saw the boar in the oak forest. Mischief twinkled in her eyes. It was a pig. He eyed the impudent Portuguese woman, positive he'd never beheld an English lady dressed like that. A coal gray vest over a white shirt and a narrow skirt. The garments could be called masculine if not for how they outlined her trim torso and flaring hips. A few buttons must have ripped during her fall, giving him a glimpse of thighs clad in scandalous black breeches. He could not object to those, at least. He squared his shoulders. It was gray and furry. Definitely not a pig. A black pig. The herds roam the oaks, eating acorns. Have you not tasted the presunto, the smoked ham? Laughter bubbled out of her in loud, unapologetic bursts, making her body bend. He caught his breath at the sultry sound, unladylike and free. Well, Englishmen, you are far away from home. A small tear left her uplifted eye and caressed her cheeks. He tracked the path down to the corner of her lips. A grunting noise intruded on her laugh. Griffin turned. A gray boar, white tusks and all, lumbered between the oaks not 10 feet from where they stood. Javali, she whispered, and her face blanched. He grabbed her hand. Listen, when I count to 3, we run for that plateau. Do you hear me? Julia nodded without taking her eyes off the menacing figure. The beast dipped its muzzle, shoulders arched, as if preparing to barrel them out of existence. 1, 2, she took off running. Stunned, Griffin followed, leather soles slipping on the loose dirt. He turned his head in time to see the beast stampeding, hooves eating the meager distance between them. Julia reached the plateau first and got stuck halfway up. He gave her a mighty shove from behind. Just as the beast's breath warmed his heels, Griffin vaulted up. She landed on her stomach, and he on top of her. Sprawling atop the rocky surface, they were a tangle of limbs and black hair. Her spine heaved with her heavy breaths, his own ruffling her mane, and her lush curves cradled his hips. Her softness and warmth fired his blood, and Griffin crouched as far away as possible. Do Portuguese women learn to count? He panted. She pushed to a sitting position, knees close to her chest. We do. We just lack the patience. Or common sense, he said under his breath. She chuckled between gasps, the sound strange but mystifying. He tried to picture a single woman of his acquaintance who would laugh in a moment like this, but could not think of any. Below, the boar pawed the ground, gaze fixed on them. Griffin reached for his pistol and winced. His gun lay out of reach. Seems we can't leave this plateau. It's a terrace. Reverently, she rolled a schist pebble in her hands, one of the Douro's wonders. Abelardo believes the Romans carved them from the hill's granite for planting grapevines. So, these were the famous terraces where grapevines had to be planted? Otherwise, the resulting wine couldn't be traded as a port. Still, even condescending, her English topped many Portuguese he knew. She belonged to the higher classes, for sure. Still, there was something else, something about the way words left her mouth, an exotic quality that made everything she said seem exciting. Your husband is a scholar, then? He is not my husband. She looked away, resting her cheek on bent knees. Are you studying these pile of rocks? He asked, but he already knew the answer. She had the air of a professional woman, not a blue-stocking. You will not get it right, will you? The corners of her lips lifted. And no, I am more of a grower type. Wine? She raised her chin. What else? A thin blood rivulet fell from the line of her hair, crimson against the warm olive of her skin. You are bleeding. He took his handkerchief and brought his face close to hers. Her eyelids fluttered shut. She smelled like earth and some exotic flower he could not name, but wished he could. A few dabs and the blood faded. She opened her eyes. The sun chose that moment to appear from behind a cloud, and the rays set fire to her irises. He could swear they blazed with a golden light. It was irrational, but he doubted others had witnessed their true color. A blast of gunfire brought them swiftly apart. The boar darted into the forest. Griffin sheltered her body as much as possible from incoming bullets while scouting for the discharge owner. A man carrying an ancient-looking musket came out from behind the boulders, ambling toward them. He wore a shirt and trousers, sans a coat, with a red sash cinched around his barrel-like waist. A disheveled beard obscured a significant portion of his face. Griffin's heart hammered in his chest as he looked between the shooter and Julia. The gunman might turn on them. Who knew what passed in these people's heads? Julia peeked from behind his torso and waved at the stranger. Obrigado, Carlo. Thank you. Do you know this man? Yes. Griffin grunted. So typical of the Portuguese to answer a question with only a literal yes or no, and it was perfectly clear it required more explanation. With a shove, he slid from the rock and came around the other side, eager to span Julia's waist and help her down. She was already on the ground, talking with the burly stranger in Portuguese. She turned from the man and looked at him, hands on her hips. Do you need assistance, Mr. Englishman? Why would I need... Her eyes twinkled and her lips twitched. I think we established you are far from home. He caught his breath. She was teasing him. It was his turn to laugh, the sound foreign and rusty. My horse is just beyond that line of trees. He passed a hand over his hair and affected his most charming smile. Listen, Well then, it was a pleasure. Before he could do so much as complete the thought, she sauntered away, hips swaying and posture erect as if she owned the world, the burly stranger by her side. At some point, he remembered to close his mouth. No woman had ever walked away from him. This has to be a day of firsts, then. The first time he missed a quarry, the first time he shot a woman, the first time... She climbed atop an odd carriage and took off, gaining speed, and a perilous curve later, she raced out of his sight.